Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our second session in our it's the fourth session in our series, the struggle for Republican ideas, struggle for democracy, and the link of Republican ideas to socialism. Tonight, we're looking at the Peterloo massacre of 1819 and Percey Shelley and his Republican ideas. And we've got with us Phil Vallender today, who has written on both. I'm very pleased to have him here. The usual format, 30 minutes, 40 minutes of the introduction, and then comrades can come in to ask questions or raise issues, make comments, etc. Please just click raise hand. If that doesn't work, put your question in the Q&A or put it in the chat where I can see it as well. No more from me. Thanks, Phil, for joining us. Off you go.
Good evening. Yes, well, it's a good time to be considering the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley and its possible implications for today, because he died, in fact, on the 4th of July 1822, exactly 200 years ago in July, and his legacy, if you like, as a radical poet has only increased over the last few decades, last 2 or 3 decades. I think I would argue that probably the greatest single popularizer, and some would say evangelizer of Shelley was in fact Paul Foote, with his book, his seminal book, some would argue, 1981's Red Shelley, 1980s Red Shelley, which has went through various iterations and editions, but established Shelley as having a radical character as opposed to being the ineffectual angel that Dr. Arnold labeled him. So it's not fair to say that Shelley always had a radical reputation. He didn't. His radicalism was very much suppressed. In fact, the only poem I ever saw of Shelley's at school was The Cloud, which was seen as a lyric and therefore fairly inoffensive. But if you read these poems more deeply, you find out that they're all pushing a revolutionary message, some more than others explicitly. So Foote, just briefly to pay some degree of, I think we should say, thanks to him, he did bring Shelley out from that shelter he was in. He created in Red Shelley a whole series of arguments about Shelley's radicalism, arguing that Shelley was, quite rightly, arguing that Shelley was a feminist. He was anti-slavery, he was anti-racist, he was a great supporter of Republican causes, and so on. So it's really, as I say, a very fitting time to be talking about him. And I hope this evening to again touch on 2 really main works of his. The Mask of Anarchy, which is one of his most famous poems, although I will be quoting from another one, which I think is also important. I will be touching also on how some of his themes are becoming more and more relevant. In one of the works I'll look at is a prose work, Philosophical View of Reform. I'm not sure if I can get this to work, but this is the only known copy I've seen printed. You won't be able to see very much. It's very, very secret in a sense. It's in a very simple cover, green cover. It was a limited edition of only 400 copies printed in 1920. And the work itself has hardly received, even to this day, received any really major exposure on a sort of mass level. But yet it does put out some quite important points about the economy, which, even though Shelley's knowledge of the economy is relatively limited, he didn't spend a lot of time reading economic tracts, but he does cotton on to the politics of inequality, and a lot of what he says is incredibly relevant to today's ideas of austerity that the right and the government are pushing, because nothing was different in his day. People were starving, people were short of money. It was after the Napoleonic Wars. And so Shelley touches on these themes like austerity, like inequality, like hunger, like abandonment of vast numbers of soldiers who came back from the Napoleonic Wars, who were found to be begging on the streets, homelessness, starving mothers particularly. He actually wrote a ballad of the starving mother. He focuses on the dislocation of the great wealth concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy classes who had inherited their wealth, i.e. the aristocracy, or the new aristocracy, as he classed it, those who become rich, mainly from the merchant class, many of whom had become rich from the slave trade. So politically, Shelley was a radical. He belonged to the radical groupings of his time. He is a prefigure of Chartism, but although he sees universal suffrage as a key thing to be achieved, in a philosophical review of reform, he goes further than that, as I'll mention a bit later. His chief preoccupations in poetry, though, are about the inevitability of change. He believes that it is inevitable, there will be change. But of his poetics, one of the things I would like to mention is his giving of the leading role of the protagonist, shall we say, of his poetry, very often are female figures. So we have the Sithna in the Revolt of Islam. She leads the revolution. We have the maid, the Manic Maid, who rises and stops the procession of anarchy. We have the whole notion of women generally figuring in many of his poems. I suppose we really ought to try and consider what Shelley meant by the word anarchy. He talks in a philosophical view of reform, he talks of three things really: fraud, imposture, and anarchy. And he sees the state, or the ruling elite of the state, the ruling class, as being there by fraud. So the king or the queen or the monarch, which he says is the string that ties the robber's bundle, is not the central preoccupation of Shelley. Yes, of course, he wants to get rid of the monarchy, but that's not the point. What the monarch does, and what Shelley sees it as being, is a masking of the anarchy of the system of capitalism, nascent capitalism, industrialization, that the majority of the population were living under. So, although the Mask of Anarchy, people always think of it as being a mask put on an individual called anarchy, in fact, it is the Mask of Anarchy that is hiding the true state, and that's carried out by both the new aristocracy, who've gained their money by fraud since 1688, when they created this constitutional monarchy, which again is a fraud because it is the masking of power through a supposed agreement of the people, if you like, to have a monarch that is controlled by a constitution. But of course, the constitution is there to serve the wealthy and the rich. So I'm going to now really revert to a paper I presented a while ago on Shelley and talk about that from that. So I will be reading some quotations for you and making references to some works. I would, at the beginning, like to suggest that everybody should try and get hold of Shelley's Revolutionary Year. It's edited now by Paul O'Brien. It's available at Bookmarks. It's Paul Foot's 1990 publication, updated with a good introduction on Peterloo by Paul O'Brien, which he wrote in August 2019. And it really is a very valuable document because it was the book that it was the book of poems that Shelley and radical works that Shelley wanted Leigh Hunt to publish. Leigh Hunt was his friend and collaborator, but because of the fear of sedition, being jailed for sedition, one of his other Republican contacts, Richard Carlile, was in jail for publishing Shelley's Queen Mab, a copy of which I have here. This is a Chartist copy from 1837. It, as you can see, is very small. The writing is terribly, terribly small, and it was designed to be carried in the pocket of the demonstrators when they marched, so that they wouldn't be arrested for carrying it. Richard Carlile was in prison for publishing Queen Mab, which was a seditious poem, it was considered, because it rails against the monarchy. Shelley was an atheist. Rails against the religion of Christianity and so on, the structure of the church, because Shelley was an atheist. So we see in that book of Paul Foot's, which is a very slim little volume, it contains the text of a philosophical view of reform. It contains the Mask of Anarchy, and it contains another excellent poem, England in 1819, among others. It's really worth getting hold of. So that's Shelley's Revolutionary Year. I'd really advise anyone who doesn't have a lot of time to read Shelley, would just like an introduction to his more revolutionary politics, would find that book valuable. So Shelley's Revolutionary Year. Really, we can say that Shelley's most radical production, although there are arguments, it's not entirely true to say they're contained in these 2 years, were in 1812, where he writes some quite radical poetry, and he's trying to produce some work to do with Ireland, to do with the whole fight for the vote. And then 1819 is what Stuart Curran, a great Shelley critic, has referred to as Annus Mirabilis. So I think the two works, as I said, I'm going to look at are the Mask of Anarchy, which I'll call the Mask, if you don't mind from now on, and Philosophical View of Reform, which is a little bit unwieldy, which I will refer to as the View. What Shelley does in Philosophical View of Reform is basically a critique of contemporary liberalism. And it's about who pays for the crisis, basically. It's saying that there are financial deficits, but they are owing to the working people by the rich and the new aristocracy. So the forces of anarchy have created this debt, Shelley argues, through these wars they fought in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, and it's not for the poor to pay them. Anarchy, the figure of anarchy, looms large in Shelley's Mask, and it's an ironic take on anarchy, of course, because what the ruling class saw, the nascent trade union movement, the rioters in Derby, the Blanketeer marches of 1816, what Shelley, what the ruling class saw them as, and of course the increasing organisation in the metropolises, like Manchester, which of course we will mention in a minute, was an organising working class. So in a sense, they saw it as anarchy to try and, it's like, a bit like the Daily Mail today. It's a distortion of the truth. What they really feared was orderly revolutionary activity, organizing. Organization was what they were afraid of. And this is Shelley's take of anarchy is therefore very ironic. It's saying the mask of anarchy is in the ruling class. It's the ruling class that is anarchy. It's not the people that they characterize as forces of anarchy. So anarchy for Shelley is the ruling class unmasked. And it is an anarchic class because it creates chaos all the time. It creates starvation, it creates dislocation, it attacks peaceful marchers and therefore sends them away in terror and chaos. And it makes peaceful demonstration very difficult. And Shelley, of course, we all know, was one of the first promoters of passive resistance. But as I'll mention it towards the end, that's not actually how Foote or others have actually settled on him. There's plenty to say that he wasn't simply a pacifist. So what does he say then? He said about this war, and if you think back to 2008 and where we are now, we've had 12 years of this kind of Tory government. Shelley in 1819 notices that there was 20 years of ceaseless war, and the majority of the people ended up destitute, and their misery resulted from, and he says, and I quote, unequal distribution, which under the form of the national debt has been surreptitiously made of the products of their labor and the products of the labor of their ancestor. And he then says, for all property is the produce of labor. So it's completely, it's an imposture, it's a fraud to suggest that the poor must pay for the crisis, because the reason they're poor and the rich are rich is because the rich has been profiting from their labor. So in a sense, it's about getting that labor back, that value of labor back. And Shelley perfectly understands that wealth is produced solely by labor, and he held that the Regency elite appropriates this wealth by masking their activities, that is the activities of the elite, under the cloak of reducing the national debt or deficit. Now, this is quite interesting because he says, you know, you're getting this now with Rishi Sunak saying that we can't spend money on the poor, we can't tax the rich oil companies, we can't do anything like that because we've got a national debt to worry about. Well, of course, Shelley would argue, who created it? And okay, we can argue about COVID being an accident, but you know, if we look back at austerity, which has been going on for 12 years, COVID was their big gift to us of our own money to help some of us. Then equally, it's now gone back to austerity again, hasn't it? Because we can't have £20 on universal credit and so on. The benefits have been cut, excuse me. What's interesting in Shelley's philosophical view of reform is that he prefigures people like David Harvey, and he says that you know, that these ruling classes are really a threat to our constitutional freedoms and individual rights and liberties. Therefore, as Harvey suggests, democracy is a luxury. And it's only possible to be very democratic and have an excellent society in periods of relative affluence, with a strong middle class presence doing well to guarantee some sort of stability. Well, Shelley understood that you couldn't really have concentrated financial power like ours, the City of London, for example, without having concentration of political power. And that's what he called the defect in government, because you have you're having it inevitable almost that government will always be almost authoritarian like it is now. If the financial crisis is getting deeper, it will get more authoritarian, and it will continue to deprive workers of their labour, and their voice in democratic government will be similarly reduced. So the fruits of labour are being taken away, but also democratic rights. Now, I find it very interesting that now we're having a rerun of all sorts of Shelleyan themes, but this idea of othering, the idea that you've got to worry now about refugees coming in dinghies and threatening our well-being. Shelly saw this as a similar way of looking. He saw it as a similar way of looking at poor workers, because the ruling class in the 1800s had an absolute fear of the mob and the working class. It was terrified of them, and that's why they had a militia in every town, and that's why more troops were garrisoned in Britain at the time of the Napoleonic Wars than actually in Europe, because they were terrified of some sort of domestic revolution. So Shelley's philosophical reform, though, the view is not only an economic critique, however. He sees political reform as a precondition to economic reform, and the view addresses what we could call the democratic deficit, and the mechanism by which regency monarchy serves the new aristocracy by masking abuses of power by the crown. In other words, what he calls the new aristocracy, that is the bourgeoisie, if you like to call it that. Shelley's attitude to parliamentary representation his attitudes were a little bit more nuanced than his quite cut and dried economic views, where he saw the national debt should just be abolished. That was his response to it. He suggested that the introduction of universal suffrage would lead to the temporary abolition of the monarchy and aristocracy, but that if it meant a republic, however just that was, this could create violence, and therefore any such abolition would only be temporary. So he's not 100% a Republican in all of his writings about reform, because the revolution in France was still something that was in living memory for many people. And so Shelley starts as a gradualist, and he also, very typical of his time, believed that it was only through mass education that you could prepare people for the responsibilities of voting. So there's this kind of paternalistic, patronizing attitude, which was quite common amongst people of his background. So he's clearly not clear in a view exactly how he wants to handle this reform. And he interrogates at some length the notions of reform of parliament and opting for, indeed, a republic. He recognizes the rational case for the latter, stating that Republican England would be a republic governed by one assembly with no chamber of hereditary aristocracy and no king to act as the rallying point, quotes here, quoting, the rallying point of those whose tendency is at once to gather and to confer that power which is consolidated at the expense of the nation. So obviously a king is a definite no-no. Shelley is a huge fan of America. He sees it as a beacon of liberty, despite the fact he recognizes slavery as an enormous problem. I think he always thought that would be abolished eventually, but he felt that America getting rid of the monarch, although we can all argue after this, probably in the question period, exactly where America's ended up now with its presidential figure looking very much like a monarch to many of us. But he does say that America still presents the best example of the rejection of 1688. so interestingly, Shelley was surrounded by reformers who he deeply respected and had many connections with, many of them publishing journals like Richard Carlisle's The Republican, Leigh Hunt's The Examiner. So there were plenty of publications weaving their way carefully through the pitfalls of censorship and jail. But Shelley does actually, in a philosophical reform of the view, he does actually criticize those who simply ask for universal suffrage. Here I draw parallels with those who are asking for proportional representation, because a lot of people, I think, are asking for that, rather hoping that that'll be the end of the road and we won't have to have a full-blown republic and an overthrow of the entire Crown in Parliament constitutional structure that we are suffering under at the moment, because every single element of the corruption scandals we're facing are directly linked to the lack of democracy in our early 21st century Parliament, which is very much, despite reforms of various sorts, to all intents and purposes, the executive is just as undemocratic and unaccountable as it ever was. Hence, they can just say, oh, well, we won't publish such and such a report, Russia report, and we're not going to do this, and we're not going to do that, and we're not going to tell you what the Queen's money is, and we're not going to say how much tax she pays, and so on. Anyway, Shelley does say that there is a need to go further, and I'm going to quote what he says here. Do not insist on the same ground for the immediate abolition, for example, of monarchy and aristocracy and the levelling of inordinate wealth, and an agrarian distribution, including parks and chases of the rich, of the uncultivated districts of the country. No doubt the institution of universal suffrage would be necessary consequence and tend to the abolition of these forms, because it is impossible that the people, having attained power, should fail to see what demagogues now conceal from them, the legitimate consequence of the doctrines which they, through which they had attained it. Thus, Shelley is clearly thinking about the main constitutional aim of the Friends of Reform, that's what they call themselves, should be a republic, although he knows that the lesser demand of universal suffrage will surely lead to a republic in any case, because you can't do proportional representation and then leave the rest as it is. You can't have universal suffrage, everyone voting, and yet leave the system the way it is. He's just conflicted about the process because he's living with the legacy of the French Republic and the terror. So Shelley homes in on the essential programmatic differences between the various radicals of the time. On the one hand, we have the Paynite Republicans, and on the others, we have the Friends of Reform. The latter would limit their demands to simply achieving universal suffrage. With his gloss of progressive forces in a view, Shelley anticipates the configuration of the Chartist movement. If these were his political aims, at least 5 of his social economic demands would probably be contained in any radical reform movement today. He calls for abolition of the national debt, disband the standing army, abolish sinecures, that is hereditary places of wealth-earning positions, abolish tithes, make all religions, all forms of opinion respecting the origin and government of the universe equal in the eye of the law. In other words, stop the Catholic discrimination against Catholics. In our case, it'd be the Islamophobia he'd be railing against that. And make justice cheap, certain and speedy, and extend the institution of juries to every possible area of jurisprudence. So I've dwelt quite a lot on his political thinking here, rather less so far on Peterloo, because I think quite a lot of you are probably more aware of that. So Shelley, I will come around to Peterloo eventually. Shelley is wary of the sudden disposal of old corruptions, institutions of aristocracy and monarchy. He is aware of the way these elements of the state structure are intertwined with the liberal economy. He writes about the Glorious Revolution of 1688, suggesting that Shelley suggests that the nobility restrained the power of the old monarchy, but realizes that power was the aristocracy's natural ally against the people, and therefore made the crown a mask and a pretense of its own authority. So in other words, the function of the monarchy is to just mask the power and create a nice, pretty theatrical thing like we saw last week, or on Monday, whenever it was, when Charles wanders in with all that gold and stuff on it, into the House of Commons, or House of Lords rather. It's about creating a kind of front for the powers, the real power behind the throne, as we say. And he says that the crucial thing was the Act of Union in 1707, where he says that the crown was then, the power of the nobility through the crown was consolidated in the Act of Union in 1707. So he understands immediately what the purpose of unionism is. For Shelley, therefore, political institutions go hand in glove with economic liberalism, which pretended to offer economic freedom, but in fact deprive people of the people of freedom to even feed themselves. It's very important because we get all this. We've got the Institute of Economic Ideas, all these Tufton Street think tanks that are really just lobby groups. Who pays for them, we don't know. But they all talk about choice, freedom, all this stuff. And Shelley already identified that this was nonsense. That in a country, in a society where there was no commitment to equal distribution of the fruits of labor of the people that worked, the laborers, then you're going to have poverty. And so therefore it was a lie, it was a fraud. And Shelley contrasted constitutional monarchy with absolute monarchy, which was found to be in, among other places, contemporary Spain, which was undergoing a revolution at the time. Shelley sees the English constitutional monarchy as worse than absolute monarchy, because he says, and I quote, "An oligarchy of this nature exacts more suffering from the people because it reigns both by opinion generated by imposture, fakery, falsehood, and the force with which opinion places within its grasp." So the constitutional monarchy co-opts the criticism of the people and makes it seem more liberal in a way, in a small L, than absolutism, and therefore it gives it more force, Shelley argues. Those who rule through a constitutional monarchy have more legitimacy because they can argue that they are, the monarchy is confined by this constitution. But in fact, Shelley argues, doesn't do any confining at all of the class that profits from the setup. In other words, constitutional monarchy co-opts the people into a commonsensical consensus. This idea of common sense is so common today. Leave aside Tom Paine's book being called Common Sense, which is in fact a confection of the elite. It's not real. And again, parallels could be drawn with the current neoliberal regime in Britain, which claims to offer people rights and choices while simultaneously withdrawing them. Costumes, words, and imposture are all masks which rulers hide behind, both in Shelley's time and ours. Now, moving on to the Mask of Anarchy and introducing some of its concepts, it's riddled with, it's two things really. The first part is a sort of pageant which describes the power of the state and how it creates anarchy, the ruling class and so on. But also it goes on to the second part, to being a kind of lesson in how to organize for change. And that happens around line 133, when the manic maid disrupts anarchy, sort of deus ex machina kind of useful dramatic device, which causes anarchy to be destroyed and thrown off the horse, the white horse. So the second part is really the part which deals with the politics. And the parts of that are both descriptive, and then he argues for some suggested solutions. So two abstract constructs that Shelley brings in are freedom and democracy. And these two, as now, are contested in the Regency period. We know about freedom being contested because they've just passed 6 bills in Parliament, all designed to restrict various freedoms. We know about democracy being restricted because they've just passed a bill to limit even further the ability of certain people to vote. So it's going on now. It's nothing. I'm not saying nothing's changed, but I'm saying it was contested in 1819. It's contested in 2022. The notions of freedom and democracy. And Shelley explored the idea of freedom both negatively and positively in the Mask, but also in the Ode to Liberty, which is, I think, included in that marvelous book, Shelley's Revolutionary Year, I mentioned at the beginning. In the Mask, Shelley repeatedly questions the idea of what real freedom is. First, he asks, what is freedom? Then again, what art thou, freedom? His first answer to this question is actually negative and echoes some of his arguments in A View, asserting that people are effectively rendered economic slaves because of the economic nature of oppression. So here we go. What is freedom? Ye can tell that which slavery is too well, for its very name has grown to an echo of your own. Shelley, however, in his second iteration of the question, what is freedom, responds positively. And it is perhaps more useful here to explore Shelley's positive view of freedom in concluding this analysis, as it is Shelley's vision of a better future which was to go on to inspire the Chartists, and which explains why they all carried pirated copies of his poems in their pockets on demonstration, why his poems were read to radical groups throughout the early 19th century, why they were even in meetings of the Communist Party in the 1920s, Shelley's poems were frequently read to meetings. So certainly before the advent of the Stalinist period, perhaps, the Shelley's poems were tremendously popular amongst Communist Party members. So what is his positive view of freedom? Well, it is, he defines it again in economic and social terms, which I think ring a bit of a bell with what Jeremy Corbyn was trying to do in 2017, when you'll have noticed rise like lions after slumber. Ye are many, we are many, ye are many, they are few, became the slogan almost of the Labour Party at that point. So in this particular verse, lines 217 to 20 of Mask of Anarchy, Shelley writes, for the labour of freedom, thou art bread and a comely table spread. Now, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because only today we're seeing Tories cutting red ribbons to food banks. And there's Shelley talking about freedom being not hungry. So freedom, for the labourer thou art bread and a comely table spread. So I suppose, Shelley, you could gloss that as being freedom from food banks. And from he uses the masculine possessive pronoun, as many of his time did. From his daily labour come to a neat and happy home. It's quite romantic, isn't it? And what that can be glossed at, as to me today, is a resolution of the housing crisis. So there's two crises going on in this Tory government, even today in 2022. 200 years after Shelley's death, we haven't got freedom from food banks and we don't have housing for all. So that's really interesting that he fastened on to those two vital elements. You can't be free if you are hungry and you don't have anywhere to live. So don't forget, Shelley intervenes, as he did in 1812, with strikes. He supported the loom workers' strikes. He supported various strikes, and he moved around England an awful lot in 1811 to 12. He was in Ireland to support the Irish revolutionaries in 1811. He comes back. He goes up to Scotland. He moves around a lot, and he's supporting struggles. So his travels taught him just how bad the situation was outside the area of London he lived in, which I suppose he most lived in was a sort of, by then it was a sort of village area of Hampstead. And also his family home was in quite nice grounds down in Horsham in Sussex. So he came from a very wealthy background, and he had an Eton education. But it's quite interesting that he didn't come out of Eton with the same values as most of the ones that are in the cabinet today, or most of the Etonian prime ministers. So freedom means being able to eat and being able to be housed. But he also defines freedom in abstract terms. Now, this is what I'm talking to you now about, is his response to the Peterloo massacre. He also defines in abstract terms. Now, he does that because the banners of the demonstrators in August 1819 in St. Petersfield, Manchester, he quotes them: justice, wisdom, peace. And they are in threes: thou art justice, thou art wisdom, thou art peace. Lines 230, 234, and 238. Shelley mentions inspirational ideas, because Shelley believes ultimately politics isn't just about the prosaic, very important arguments for political change being formulated out of concrete analytical discussions, but art desperately needs to play its role. Science, he's a huge fan of science. That's why he's so against the church and the superstition, as he saw it, of organized religion. Poetry for Shelley was a very broad definition, because he saw poetry as, excuse me, including scientific thought. Things of beauty. I mean, he could understand science was a beautiful thing because it was dealing with things to do with the world, and he was interested in the world. And thought. So he believes it's very important to study philosophers. And he believes that the new thinking, as he sees it, of utilitarianism, and that can be taken in certain directions to inspire change, because it ultimately is saying, what's the use of a lot of these structures we have? What do they serve? So he also believes in the necessity of ordered collective action. So Shelley's view of, I should just say this first before I go any further, that he had a very broad view of what an artist was, or what a poet was. Francis Bacon, Michelangelo, Raphael, Newton, all these people were poets for him because they are creating things. So he says that poets are the legislators of the world. He argues that in his Defense of Poetry, which was the last text, the final text he actually wrote before he drowned, completed, I should say. And that text is fascinating because it kind of, he does include some of philosophical view of reform in that discussion of poetry, which makes it very clear he has a much deeper and broader view of what art and poetry were and are than many of his contemporaries.
Bill, just a quick second. You've spoken now for 45 minutes.
Okay, I'll be tying up now. I've just got another 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 40 seconds to go.
Yes.
Okay, so what is he proposing? He's proposing that there should be mass action, hence let a great assembly be of the fearless and the free. And he does mention England a lot, but I don't think he's an English nationalist. Some people have suggested this. I don't think he is. I think England was seen as the predominant force, and I think he understood something which a lot of people who argued for Remain, in my view, didn't fully understand, is that you need to demolish the English Union if you wish to remain in Europe, because it is actually holding us back politically. So he sees England as having a great many good things, and he appeals to the history of England, but he's not an English nationalist. And therefore, moving to my conclusion, I would say that in the Brexit debate, as well as the wider world, we're seeing a desperate struggle to protect liberal democratic values as freedom and democracy. And Shelley would certainly have recognized the misappropriation of these values, especially in the manner in which they're being used by those engaged in the fraudulent, as I describe it, to quote Shelley, fraudulent Brexit project. So thus, by revisiting the 17th century, a view locates the source of the political conflicts of Regency England in 1819, but Shelley provides us with useful insights to the state we find ourselves in 2022. He asks us to reclaim the meaning of liberty, and if there was ever a time when we needed to do that, it's now. So I think one of the things Shelley and his radicals do teach the left in this country, and for me that's the whole lot of the left, is that constitutional arrangements are not some adjunct that you sort of sort out after the revolution. They're central. It's the politics of the political economy. And Shelley's philosophical view of reform, his 1819 production, I would argue, makes that point more strongly than any other. And then lastly, I would say, it's hard to imagine for us just how appalling the shock and awe was of the Industrial Revolution to those who experienced it, the dislocation it inflicted on the many, whose lot in life was to produce the wealth for the few. The England of Shelley provided distorting and fractured foundations for today's economic and social environment, just as the revolution of 1688 can be argued to be the reason behind some of today's Brexit sentiment, I mean the 1707 Act of Union particularly. Finally, Shelley reminds us as we go through our own dramatic upheavals that even 200 years later, some truths, and he said this, can be held as, so he quotes, can be held as self-evident. And he says there is an inevitability for radical change. Let us not believe only that it is necessary because it is just and ought to be, but necessary because it is inevitable and must be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. I enjoyed that. I thought that was great. I think it gives a really good insight into some of Shelley's thinking in terms of constitutional issues and democracy. I think that's really important. The question of you have an illusion of choice, an illusion of freedom, which still very much applies today. You have the illusion of elections every 5 years. You can elect who's going to be your butcher in reality, isn't it?
Well, you can now have elections as to who's going to build your extension or not in the new planning laws. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, maybe sideways, really. When you come back, it would be good to hear a bit more about the issue of the pacifism that you mentioned, and Paul Foot saying that he wasn't actually so pacifist. I think that would be interesting.
Right.
But we have a few people with their hands up, so we'll
if I can find some. I can see if I find the actual part of that. Now you've raised it. I was going to do it, and then I realised I'd lost the paper.
Okay. Well, while Tony is talking, you can look for it. Tony.
Thank you. The hot seat first. Well, yeah. Thank you very much, Phil. It was an incredibly interesting talk, I have to say.
By the way,
Yes.
I haven't seen you for a long time.
I know, I was going to say, Phil and I both went to that revolutionary institution, Brighton Polytechnic, the height of the student rebellion of the 1970s. Unfortunately,
Indeed.
it now declined somewhat. But I suppose my first question really is, what would Shelley make of today if he happened to be reborn into the situation we have, where we have, to all intents and purposes, universal suffrage, where we have choice, mass consumer choice, for example. What would you say about the mask and who was wearing it, and what it was that was being hidden? Would you see any changes? Would it, and
Well,
so on? Because I know it is an important concept, because if you wear a mask to disguise the reality of power, which is what you're saying he saw the monarchy as.
well, the monarchy acts as the mask of the anarchic ruling class.
Which I think is an incredibly important concept.
Which is quite clever, I think.
Yes. Then your real target is not monarchy, because the mask is only hiding the power beneath and behind.
Do you know what he said, how he defined the monarchy? I don't know if I mentioned this because I was kind of doing stuff with Dan reading. I think he cited Paine on this, but it might have been his own thought. He said it's the string that ties the robin.
Yeah, no, I know. It's the most famous, I think, of his sayings.
Yes.
And that's absolutely right. It's the icing on the cake. It beautifies and prettifies the sordid mass hiding below. And that's, of course, true, isn't it? With all the pomp and that we see now, you know, the funny clothes and the identification with the royal family, who, quote, are really just like you and me, dysfunctional and so on.
Absolutely.
Of course, it has an incredibly important political purpose. But I think people make a mistake if they say that the monarchy is the main target, because it leaves out all those that are hiding behind that mask. One question I wanted to ask you was, did Shelley have anything to say about British colonialism at that time? I mean, because the empire was getting into its stride, there was the jewel in the crown and so on. The Napoleon.
I'm not an expert on Shelley's Orientalism. He was interested in India and because he spoke and wrote, he could read and write perfectly Sanskrit. So he spoke 7 languages, or worked in 7 languages, translated in 7. Right. So he was a formidable linguist. So I'm sure he knew he wouldn't have done it without making some kind of effort to learn the history of it, because he always learned the context, political and historical, of any artistic endeavor. But I would say to you that he did support the Haitian Revolution. He was adamant that the slaves were correct to rebel against the French. This wasn't the typical Anglo anti-French thing. It was just he was anti-colonial.
Sure.
He goes into Ireland, and if you treat Ireland as a colony, then, which it was, then he was definitely on the right side when it came to that, because he got followed out of Ireland by the Home Office, rather like Coleridge and Wordsworth did before they sold the pass after the French Revolution.
So he was more than, if you like, some of the bourgeois thinkers of the time, Paine and then John Stuart Mill and so on, for whom imperialism or colonialism for them was sacrosanct in many ways. I mean, John Stuart Mill in On Liberty was in favour of freedom for everyone, bar the barbarians or the savages that they met in the colonies. So again,
that's right. And so many of the anti-slavery people ironically, some of them were slave owners. They probably did it because they were hoping to get some money out of it. But I mean, quite a lot of them were very confused, of course, being slave owners. But they did actually help give life to the anti-slavery movement. Some of the people you'd expect to be supporting it, who were radicals, didn't. This is one of the great kind of great contradictions of that period.
I was going to ask you, would you describe me, because Marx talked about a section of the ruling class in a revolutionary situation breaking away. Would you see Shelley as a revolutionary or as a revolutionary Democrat? And I think there is an important difference.
I think it's important not to import modern day or even Marxist. This is where I kind of diverged from Foote, because Foote was kind of, I mean, you know, Foote. I heard somebody give a talk on Shelley, and they branded Foote as the SWP Shelley. You know, it was an attempt to turn him into some. Well, it was trying to make him into something that suited the narrative that, you know, he's a revolutionary socialist poet, which was not the case. But it's true to say that I think a revolutionary Democrat. You see, we don't know what would have happened. He died in a boating accident at the age of 29. He was just 30, actually. His birthday's in August, and he died in July 22. We don't know where he would have gone. I mean, on a literary level, he would have gone to the stars, because he was only just getting started. I mean, it really, you know, I don't do cheap comparisons, but if you think about Jimi Hendrix being cut off after 3 years and what he'd done in 3 years, you look at what Shelley did in 1819, it's absolutely the most massive literary production in the history of English letters. There is no comparison to it. Now, if you think about his politics, I don't think he would have drifted to the right, because he had Mary Shelley on his back all the time, and she was very sharp about his. You read their letters, you know, she reproves him if she thinks he's selling, you know, becoming a bit kind of whatever it is that, you know. So he lived in a radical circle. He had people who did drift, but there were some people who were very just satisfied with the 1832 Act. He would not have been satisfied with that. You see, Leigh Hunt got the Mask of Anarchy in 1819 and put it in a drawer, because to have published it would have meant a jail sentence. So when does he publish it? He publishes it in 1837. I think it was 1837. But anyway, he published it because the Great Reform Act has happened, and therefore legitimated the idea of reform. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, I don't think Shelley would have put up with that. I think he'd have gone further. But he had no time for what we would call ultra-lefts, like the Spenceans, or these secret conspiracies like the Cater Street conspiracy type people, because he believed in open democratic debate. And he just would not have. He would have gone with a mass party, I'm sure, or mass, you know, sizable party. But to answer your question, I think he would have been a revolutionary Democrat, and he probably would have. He would have pushed for harder constitutional reform. I think that's where he would have gone. You see, if we got rid of, he always had a contradiction, because he wanted Charles I dead, because he was a reactionary, but he was also against capital punishment. So he had a bit of a problem there, because of course his police Charles I was executed, but he didn't approve of capital punishment.
Well, it's not necessarily a contradiction.
Well, let's be careful.
I mean, I'm opposed to it, but I will make exceptions for some.
Well, we can't have sort of selective executions, I don't think. Anyway, so Shelley really identifies where things go wrong as the restoration of the Stuarts.
But can I just ask, Phil?
Yeah.
At the time of Peterloo, as you say, there was a great fear of the rabble and the mob.
Yes.
And you had in Peterloo, I mean, naked class vengeance with the yeomanry riding out amidst a mass working class demonstration. But you've had very few instances of that since. You've had the violence of the miners' strike. You've had instances of where the military have taken up machine gun posts, I think in Liverpool.
We had the murders in Ireland of the Bogside, which happened exactly in 1969. Exactly.
Well, that's a colony. That was always, violence was always meted out to our colonies up to today, for that matter. But in the homeland, you didn't have the same thing. So would he have foreseen the way that universal suffrage has gone, the way that the ruling class has been able to maintain a consensus? And in that sense,
I think he would, because, as I was about to say, the reason why he goes back to 1688 is he sees that as the source of all the problem, because it's an unfinished revolution. It's a masking of real change.
But has the mask
the Mask of Anarchy is 1688?
Yeah, but what I'm asking is, has that mask become firmer, stronger, more fixed today? In other words, people do not see what they saw then.
I think I'm trying to say that I think what we're suffering from is the fact the unfinished revolution for Shelley would have been, had he lived, he would have promoted the abolition of the monarchy, getting rid of the House of Lords, getting rid of the church in the crown, the idea of the crown. He'd have argued for a popular sovereignty, but only within the confines of what he understood to be. I mean, he was an elitist in this sense. He was nervous of disorder, and he was terrified of the French Revolution happening again. I mean, you know, it left a terrible scar on them. And so he would have wanted it to have been a controlled release of the thing. But you see, the Reform Acts that followed 1832 didn't change the fundamental structures of the state. They were just accommodations of the crown, the ruling class, the anarchy, if you like, accommodating itself to those who were felt decent enough and honest and fair, safe enough to be admitted into the voting booths.
What do you think you would have made, say, of the Bolshevik Revolution and the shooting?
Last question now from you, Tony. Does have
I know. Sorry about that.
I don't have an answer to 1917. I have to confine myself to 1819. I'm afraid.
Right.
I'd like to debate that with you another day. When I see you in Brighton next, we must sit down and have a chat about it.
Absolutely, yes.
It's very interesting. It's a very interesting question.
If the Shelley book that you quote, is that the same as Red Shelley?
No, Red Shelley is the big book he published in 1980. Shelley's Revolutionary Year is Foote's faithful, with his introduction, Foote's faithful reproduction of what we know were the poems that he wanted, what he called his exoteric poems, which were going to be sent to Leigh Hunt. And after he got no answer on philosophical view of reform, he gave up at that point. He didn't send any more stuff. And Mask of Anarchy lay in a drawer, as I say. But they're all in that one book. It is the actual book that Shelley wanted. That's why it's an important document.
All right. Thanks for clarifying.
Yes. Thank you, Tony, for your question.
Bye-bye, Tony.
Thank you for your answers.
Okay, Marie.
See you soon, Tony. Bye-bye.
Hi, Marie.
It's my turn, is it?
It is, yes. Finally.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Phil, for this very rich speech and rich subject, of which I can only touch a small side, but in the hope of improving. I see that you mentioned something like Shelley said, the poet as legislator of the world. And now you were cut off by Tina at that point. And I wonder if you could take this opportunity to return to this. To me, it is very moving because it seems to me here he's a very complete person who is putting art at the service of the human relation. He's passionate about the human relation, how people treat each other. This is probably the most important thing about it. And he is looking to put every beauty of art at the service of change so that people can live dignified lives. This is what I get from what you have said. I would like you to come back also, if you have time, on the question of the terror, which has been touched there with Tony. It seems to me that he was a man of his time and a man of his class, and therefore he had his own take on the revolution. But the fact that he was able, in such a repression, because there was terrible repression throughout all this, to liberate his thinking, to produce his ideas. And I think, to finally finish what I'm saying, he came up with things which are completely topical, including the debt, the getting rid of the army, the sinecures, the tithe, the question of the religious question, the justice to be cheap. These are enormously practical points.
Oh yeah, but he's a very practical person.
Right, continue, please, Phil.
So what is it you exactly would like me to?
I would like you to come back on the point of the poet as legislator of the world. Can you expand?
Shelley argues in defense of Percey that the poet apprehends the unseen relations between things. The reason why poets are not classified as literary poets by Shelley, but as everybody who's created something beautiful, be it sculpture, be it mathematical genius like Newton, or scientific things like Bacon and so on. He sees philosophers as being poets. I mean, he takes this view that it's about people who can give you insight. They get that light from wherever it is, and they reflect it through what he calls in defense of poetry the mirrors of futurity. The mirrors of futurity, that they can see. This isn't some kind of half-baked hippie thing. It's actually is about saying, if you have that kind of genius, that kind of, you have to share it, and you have the ability. When the ruling class is peddling this twaddle, this rubbish, your job is, as a poet, is to tell the truth, is to enunciate. And why do poets feature in so many revolutionary moments? Why are so many revolutions accompanied by poets? I mean, think Chile, you know? I mean, Pinochet arrested the poets.
Victor Jara.
Yes, exactly. Why were they killing them? Because they're frightened of them. Because these people can inspire, and we don't want inspiration. We want drones. We want dullards. We want, you know, I mean, Shelley, you can go back to Alexander Pope and Pope's description of in the Dunciad of anarchy. And it's a different anarchy to the one Shelley's talking about. But Pope was very aware of the fact that the role of many journalists, the Grub Street scribblers, as he called them, his job was to damp down people's consciousness. It's the same as the mass circulation newspapers today. I mean, you know, Shelley would say, where are the poets that are pointing out that it's not about Starmer's beer or anything? It's about the fact we've got people cutting ribbons at food banks. It's about the fact that this is an obscenity in a so-called first world country, that 2.8 million people aren't eating a meal a day or aren't eating properly, and that 1.4 million are going a whole day without eating. I mean, you know, this is what the poet's role would be. So the unacknowledged legislator is because they don't sit in a parliament. Poets don't sit in parliaments. They don't sit in senates of universities. They don't sit in council chambers. They are plugged into a different level of consciousness, if you like, and their job is to raise the consciousness. And that's why in the Mask of Anarchy, there's a kind of shining light that comes with this maniac maid. And that's the moment. It's a contrivance, but that's the moment when Shelley achieves his change from the description of anarchy's parade into the, if you like, the political lesson of the last 200 lines of the poem. But yes, I mean, I think that in itself is a revolutionary idea. Yeah, and I think that the fact the left has not understood the importance of driving forward to a popular democracy means that we are absorbed in the minutiae of irrelevance, because everything comes from what in Shelley's view, comes from old corruption, right? Which is the ruling class as established in 1688, which has gone on to take over, you know, I mean, he attacks paper money because he thinks that can be faked and, you know, is open to being defrauded. But we've got a similar problem because we've got a country full of people who are completely lost in the minutiae of a lot of irrelevance, you know, tittle tattle, you know, whether there's Waggergate and all that stuff, you know. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And we don't have that clear thing, which old corruption was the 1688 thing. The corruption that all of this, I believe, comes from, and which Shelley, I'm sure, would be railing against were he alive today, is the corruption of the Crown in Parliament. It's the fact it's an unseen, unseeable, unknowable blob which we can't penetrate, but yet exercises enormous power and influence over our lives. And just look at how many laws don't go through Parliament or aren't examined by Parliament or aren't properly read. I mean, they're now claiming that they didn't know that the treaty they signed with the EU said what it said. Well, one's hardly surprised when Ian Duncan Smith said, great, we got Brexit done in one day. We didn't waste even 6 weeks on it. We got it done in 6 days. You know, that's us compared to Theresa May. And now you look at what a useless Parliament we have. And it's completely incapable of delivering anything for the common people. It's just, to me, that's the source of all corruption.
Yeah. It's also a shame that much of the left doesn't take the question of democracy or the monarchy seriously and thinks it's a
Constitution, I think, is the thing.
Yeah. Steve Freeman.
Hi, thanks, Phil. That was an absolutely excellent talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm just going to stick on your themes, really, and I just want to make a couple of observations, well, in a way to slightly answer what Tony said. I think, you know,
yes,
because
I don't know anything.
It obviously I think, and you'll tell me if I've got this right, but 1688 to 1707 is the key period for the formation of our modern state and constitution. So in a way, what Shelley is doing here is doing a critique of constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
In a way, that's what he's doing. And the England bit within that, by the way, is not because he's a national chauvinist, because he wants to change England. But because he wants to change England doesn't mean he doesn't want to change Ireland or Scotland or Wales. But obviously he thinks England's a key point in all this that needs to be changed. So if you want to change England, it doesn't make you a chauvinist or anything like that. So,
a nationalist.
Or a nationalist. Matt, so in this critique of constitutional monarchy, the monarchy is a mask which conceals anarchy, fraud, corruption, etc., etc. I like the anarchy is I love the anarchy idea. They could just the ruling class are creating anarchy amongst us, setting us up fighting amongst ourselves all the time, breaking up things that we're doing, breaking up organizations so they can keep power. So they spread anarchy amongst us because they hate our organization. But in all of this, so the monarch in this constitutional monarchy, the monarch, as you say, is a mask. Could be a mask for this system, but Tony concludes from that, well, if it's only a mask, we don't need to worry about it. But the real point, if people want to abolish the monarchy, is we want to tear the mask away. We want to pull the curtain back so that people can truly see the anarchy, fraud, and corruption that's going on, which is concealed by these institutions. That's really why we need to do something about them. And in a way, the Queen exists, or the monarchy exists, to prove that we're a democracy. Now, that seems slightly counterintuitive. But the idea is the monarchy, they always tell us, the monarchy has no power because we all did away with it in 1688, more or less. We just keep having the Queen to turn up and open festivals. So that's why we're a democracy, because we've got a Queen still. You know, we don't worry about our democracy for that reason. But we saw recently that in the House of Lords that you referred to, the Crown turned up
on a cushion,
and sat on a cushion and sat next to it. Like the Crown comes in a separate car, and it's then carried into the House of Lords, and it's sat on a chair next to Prince Charles. So the Crown wasn't clearly the Queen, and that's the whole point of 1688, to separate the Queen, who stayed, I don't know where she was somewhere else, but the Crown came along and had to sit on this chair. And that's because the Crown and the Queen are not the same thing. That's the mask. The Crown is actually power. It's not just a headpiece you put on with gold on it. It's actually a symbol of the power of the state.
Can I stop you there? Because in fact, the Crown sits on the Queen's head simply because the monarch's job is to actually mask that power of the Crown. Is to make people believe it doesn't exist as a power, because people conflate Crown with monarch, and that's not the same thing. They are not synonymous.
No.
The power of the state is in the Crown, as in the Crown in Parliament. Sovereignty is vested in the Crown. That is the government and all the other stuff. The Queen is merely there to kind of keep people happy and open a few church fates. And if you notice the Queen, Steve, she never actually says anything. They all say her great achievement, this is what I've heard, 70 years of service, and she's never said anything that anyone can remember.
Yes.
Nobody can remember. There's no quote from the Queen, is there, that you go,
no, it's not. Okay, you've got that, and that's one of the reasons that proves why we're a democracy, because we've got this Queen who never says anything. Obviously, she started saying stuff. Hang on a minute, who said you could say that? Who let you say that? So she can't say anything to prove that we're a democracy, except, of course, the little occasions where she has some little obscure way of telling the people of Scotland it would be a good idea if you voted.
Yeah.
If you voted didn't vote for yes for Scottish independence. She stood at Crathy's church, by the way, and then some people turned up, and then she said to them, "You've got to think harder how you vote." And everybody understood that interpretation to mean you've got to vote no. And as David Cameron later said afterwards, she was cheering down the phone when the no vote came through, because it's because the union's also about the power of the state. So the point that for Tony that doesn't get, if you strip away the monarch, then you reveal the power of the crown that's hiding behind it. And it's the power of the crown, which is ultimately the power of capital. Yeah. It's that huge power of capital politically concentrated into the crown.
This, I mean, to stay on the Shelley theme a minute.
Which the monarchy is the
Shelley theme a minute, the return to that. I mean, this is why philosophical view of reform is so important, because he fastens on to the nature of the City of London. I mean, that's what he's understood. He's understood that there is a relationship between the city, the monarchy, and the crown, the ruling class, and anarchy, if you like. But anarchy, if in Peter Bell III, he talks about tramping up and down London town, being in the City of London. And he described, I mean, Peter Bell, by the way, was a poem by Wordsworth. So part of it's a satire. He didn't do satire much, but he satirizes Wordsworth. But it's actually that he identifies the pension parliament as being pensioned off by the city. So all these people sitting in Parliament, they're paid for by the city, because it provides the cash to run the joint, you know. So I think really the point you want to make about that thing that Tony probably hasn't understood. I just wanted to say that before you went any further with that, Steve, because I think it's important to understand that he did understand that the masking of it all ultimately is the City of London, because that's where the finance of slavery comes from. Yeah. That's how he knows slavery built the City of London. Sugar. Shelley wore an S brooch on his jacket, which was to say he didn't take sugar, because refusing to take sugar was a sign of being against the slave trade. Okay, so there was already solidarity with slaves being freed and liberated amongst radicals. They may not have talked about a lot of the aspects of racism that we do today, because we've been informed by excellent scholarship from all over, from these countries, which have taught us so much that we just pretend it didn't happen and are still pretending it didn't happen. I mean, look at Black Lives Matter. I mean, Shelley would have been there like a shot. Absolutely, because he was supporting the Haitian Revolution. He was, he knew about these people's politics because he'd learned about it also through France, because many of them were in France, the leaders of Black radicalism in France. There were several of them there in the revolution. So, yes. Could I read a few lines from England in 1819 to close us with, because I think we're getting near the end now, aren't we?
Yes, that'd be good, yeah.
Could I read that? So this is England in 1819. He wrote again, this is in his Annus Mirabilis. So it's a difficult poem, but it's still got some excellent images. An old, mad, blind, despised and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring, rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop blind in blood without a blow, a people starved and stabbed in the untilled field, an army whom liberticide and prey makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay. Religion, Christless, godless, a book sealed, a Senate, Timesworth statute. That's Catholic emancipation. Timesworth statute unrepealed. Our graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. That's some sonnet, I reckon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Phil. That was a really interesting session. I think lots of positive comments and comrades have enjoyed.
Thank you very much. I haven't read them all. I hope you save them so I can read them at a later date.
We will send them to you. Yes, no problem.
Because I don't get many letters these days. So
we'll post your email address up publicly so people can send you email.
No, I don't want that. No, I don't want to be mobbed by my fan.
The fan base, yes, it's expanded massively after tonight.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for coming along. And it's also very fitting. Next week we'll be looking at the Chartists, and I think the overlap there has become quite obvious. The Chartists, obviously, the first democratic working class organization that had a lot of similar demands to what Phil described.
They all read Shelley.
They all read Shelley. They all had them with them in their back pockets. We know that now. And we're spending 2 sessions actually looking at the Chartists. So that'll be very interesting. And maybe Phil will come along and tell us about it. Comrades, have a good evening and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.